will come from Genesis, be chapter 25, verses 27 through 34. And I will be reading from the King James Version. And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau, because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sod pottage, and Esau came in from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, Sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me? And Jacob said, Swear to me this day. And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright.
And we're in Acts, the 15th chapter tonight, and the name of our lesson this evening is A Church That Takes a Stand. And I hope you'll be here to study with us this evening. This past Friday night, Candy and I went out to eat at this real expensive restaurant. We went for two reasons. Number one, we were hungry. Number two, someone gave us a gift card to that restaurant. And so this was that kind of restaurant where you go in and everything is all swanky. You know, if you're like me, you feel a little out of place. There were people really dressed up. Not that we were not kind of dressed up. I mean, we were just kind of casual, but there were people really dressed up. But then I opened up the menu, and I was really glad someone gave us this gift card because everything on the menu was pretty expensive. This is the kind of place where everything is a la carte. You know, your main dish is one price. Your sides are another price. If you wanted to get a salad or a bowl of soup or dessert, it's all a la carte. And it all adds up real fast. And you know, you could have gotten an appetizer or a salad or a bowl of soup of some kind. And it was pretty expensive soup. I'll just be honest with you. However, it is not the most expensive soup in the world because that distinction belongs to a restaurant in London, England called the Kai Mayfair Restaurant. And they have a bowl of soup in this restaurant that if you were paying with American dollars would cost you $190 for one bowl of soup. This soup contains shark's fin, abalone, Japanese flower mushroom, sea cucumber, dry scallops, some kind of chicken, some kind of ham, some kind of pork, and some ginseng. Apparently, it's the shark's fin that is so hard to come by because if you want some of this soup, you have to order it 5 days in advance. Must be how long it takes to catch a shark. You have to order it 5 days in advance. And it is so good. It is so good that reportedly Buddha, a vegetarian, snuck out of the monastery, jumped over the wall in order for him to go and get a bowl of this soup. The name of this soup is Buddha Jumps Over the Wall. It's the name of the soup. Now that's an expensive bowl of soup. $190. But I would submit to you, it is still not the most expensive bowl of soup that has ever been eaten. As a matter of fact, in this passage, here in Genesis chapter 25, you read about the most expensive bowl of soup in the world ever. I want to ask you, have you ever been caught in a situation like this? Someone says, I don't even know what it means to sell a birthright. Well, just forget that part. You don't have to know what it means to sell a birthright to know if you've been in a situation like this. Have you ever been in a situation where you had such a desire to do something at the very moment that you had the desire, that at the time it seemed worth it no matter what the consequences might be on down the road? Have you ever sinned because you had a desire that was worth more right then than something that would come later? I imagine if all of us were being completely honest, we would have to say, yes, I have done that. But I would suggest to you that when a person sins over physical desires, what happens is the here and now becomes more important than the hereafter. And you know, that is a very serious thing that can happen with all of us. Let me show you how Esau did that very same thing here in verse 32. If you'll look at the way it is rendered in the New King James, it says that Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me?" I think another translation perhaps puts it in a more modern way of thinking about it, especially for our lesson today. The New Living Translation says, "Look, I'm dying of starvation, and what good is my birthright to me now?" You see what Esau did? He assumed that the now, the here and now, was more important than what would come later. His physical desire was so great that it clouded his thinking about the consequences of what would come later. And what you really need to know about the selling of the birthright was it was the most important thing, physically speaking, in this lifetime that he really had. Other than his soul, of course. That's how important this transaction really was. Esau was thinking with his physical mind about his desires more than he was thinking about his spiritual priorities. The bottom line, and it's the name of our lesson this morning, the bottom line is Esau exchanged his destiny for his desire. And I want to ask you this question, and I think you already know the answer. Is it possible for us to do that today? And yes, it is possible for us to do that today. Maybe the better question is to consider, how is it possible for us to do this very same thing today? For us to exchange our destiny for a desire. Well, that's what I want us to consider here in the next few minutes this morning in our lesson. I want to give you 3 ways that this is possible for you today. And I'm not saying that these are the extent of all the ways that this is possible, but there are some of the ways that I think are most common. The first thing is to consider how sexual sin is one of those times when we exchange the desire of now for later consequences. We can do that in a physical sense when we sin. It's sexual sin. But I always would remind you that anytime you sin, you're exchanging the here for the hereafter if you do not seek forgiveness of that sin. So in a spiritual sense, it's possible to sacrifice the here, or rather the hereafter for the here. You know, this world has literally always been filled with sexual sin. I've encouraged people, when I've made that statement before, to go back and read the book of Genesis. If you doubt that this world has always had sexual sin in it, go back and read the book of Genesis, the very first book in the Old Testament. And I'm telling you, if you're watching for it, you'll be shocked at the number of times that people sinned in a sexual way in the book of Genesis. More than you'll ever imagine. But yet I would remind you that that's not an excuse for people continuing to sin in this regard today. Today, the prevalence of sexual sin shouldn't be just passed off as normal. As a matter of fact, statistics suggest to us that sexual sin is at a very high level in our country. Just concerning teenagers, the pregnancy level of teenagers is higher today than any of the other developed nations in the United States. Statistics suggest that 75% of teenagers, by the time they leave the teens and get to 20, will have committed some type of sexual sin. Would have had sex. Teens in the United States, statistics suggest, are more likely to have sex before the age of 15 than all the other developed countries in the world, including Sweden, France, Canada, and the United Kingdom. You may say, well, that's the world. That's what people in the world are doing. But when you look at statistics that involve those who say that they're Christians, I would submit to you that we are just as guilty. 60% of Americans who say that they are Christians believe it cohabitation, living and therefore sleeping with someone who's not your spouse, is okay. And what's even more disturbing, 42% of those who say they're Christians believe that a sexual relationship with someone other than your spouse is all right. It's okay. But see, here's the problem. It reminds me a lot of the problem of getting water into a boat. Now think about it in this way. A boat belongs in the water, doesn't it? Of course. But water never belongs in the boat. A boat belongs in the water just like a Christian has to live in the world. I mean, this is our place of abode, as long as the Lord sees fit to allow time to go on as it is. A Christian has to live in the world. A boat belongs in the water, but water never belongs in the boat. Just like the world should never enter into the Christian. That's our great challenge. See, John said it like this: do not love the world or the things that are in the world. If any man loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And he goes on to say in verse 16, for all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. Christians belong in the world, but the world does not belong in Christians. In John 17:11, Jesus said that we are in the world, but He said in verse 16, we are not of the world. So we've got to make sure that we're not guilty of becoming worldly and just excusing the prevalence of sexual sin in our surroundings. We've got to make sure that we remain distinct, that we remain different, that we remain called out. Just what are some of these sexual sins that many people are willing to sell out for? Well, first of all, obviously there's the premarital sins, premarital sexual sins, relationships before people get married. In your New Testament, you often read of fornication or sexual immorality, and that's what this is referring to. It's a very general term for sexual sin, sexual immorality or fornication. Also, a little bit more specifically, what the world might call an extramarital affair, but it's what the Bible refers to as adultery. It involves at least one person who's married having a sexual relationship with someone who's not their spouse. And then of course, we live in this world where homosexuality seems to be the new in sin. People are actually congratulated when they announce that this is how they are, that this is the lifestyle that they want to live. And yet, it says back in the Old Testament that a man who lies with another man like he lies with a woman, it's an abomination before God. And yes, there are plenty of times in the New Testament that this sin is addressed as well. And then, of course, one that's very prominent today is pornography. It's possibly the easiest of all sexual sins to participate in because you can do it a lot of times when nobody else is watching or nobody else, it seems, knows. Of course, God, He always knows. He always sees what we're doing. And the problem is it plants thoughts into our hearts that causes us to think about things that aren't right and sometimes do things that aren't right. And then I'll throw this one in there as well. It may not necessarily fit along with these other four things, but abortion. Because abortion really fits under this umbrella because unplanned pregnancy is often the result of sexual sin among the unmarried. I know sometimes people who get married may choose to have abortions as well, but often it comes along with sexual sin among the unmarried. I saw this bumper sticker not too long ago, and it said, if you can't feed them, don't breed them. But you know something far worse than bringing a child into this world and not being willing to care for that child is bringing a child into this world and not allowing that child to be born, terminating the life of that child. It's murder. What is in that mother's womb is alive. It has identity. God recognizes a person inside the mother's womb, and to terminate that life is just the same as murder. You see, Romans 1 recognizes every one of these sins, sometimes specifically, but if not in general. Romans 1 recognizes every one of these sins. And as I said just a moment ago, the term sexual immorality or fornication is used there. And again, it's a big, broad term that would include every type of sexual sin. But that's not really what I wanted to remind you about. I want to remind you that Romans 1 and verse 32 says that those who practice such things are deserving of death. Wouldn't you agree that when a Christian allows sexual sin to come into their life, that all of a sudden water is getting into the boat? The world is getting into the Christian, and it's a serious problem. And it's something that many people are willing to exchange their destiny for. They're willing to let a desire for the here cloud their thinking about the hereafter. And then there also are selfish sins. Here's another way that we allow the here to be more prominent in our thinking than the hereafter. You know, in one sense, all sin is selfish. I understand that. Because not only do we choose the now when we sin, we also choose the me when we sin. We choose the me instead of choosing the we, or the others, or God, or the church. I don't know if you've ever noticed how important it is for us to have the right attitude about others. Christianity is a one another religion. It's an others religion. And there are times when we are encouraged to make an inspection of self. There are times that we're encouraged to make sure that we're accountable to ourselves. Because each one of us, the Bible says in Romans chapter 14, will give an account of ourselves to God. But so often sin occurs when we think too much about self and we're not thinking about the we or others or the church or God. What are some of those sins? Let me just mention three things. Number one, the sin of abuse. There are different kinds of abuse, as you know. There's verbal abuse, there's physical abuse, there's sexual abuse that exists in our world today. And you'd be surprised, you'd be probably sickened to know that abusers are a lot closer to you than you realize. Matter of fact, many abusers sit on church pews just like you're sitting on a church pew every Sunday. They may be sitting closer to you than you realize. And see, the problem with abuse is it is a selfish sin. It is a failure to take into account what Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. The golden rule, which we basically paraphrase and say, do to others as you'd have them do to you. No abuser would ever have anybody do that to them. So they're thinking selfishly. They're not thinking about the other person. But the sin of abuse, it not only hurts the one who commits the sin, and it does hurt them, but obviously it hurts those who are being abused, who are being damaged physically, psychologically, and often even spiritually. It's a very selfish sin. What about the sin of anger? You know, anger, as we sometimes say, is one letter short of danger. You know how true that is. I know it's possible for us to get angry without sinning. Paul said that was possible, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26. Jesus demonstrated it was possible, John chapter 2 and verse 15. But see, most of us aren't that clever, spiritually speaking. We really struggle with our anger, and often when we get angry, we just go ahead and sin. We get into that danger zone and we sin. Would you agree that it's a problem for a Christian to get angry and stay angry? You know, there are a lot of Christians, there are a lot of people in the church who got angry about something a long time ago and they never got over their anger. They've just stayed angry. When I read my Bible, I read that Paul tells us in Philippians 4 verse 4 that we should rejoice. He said, and again I say, rejoice. There's something that doesn't go along with the Christian life, and that's a person being angry all the time. Did Jesus ever get angry? Yeah. Did Paul ever get angry? Sure. They didn't stay angry. And they didn't allow their anger to become sin. Jesus especially didn't. But they understood you don't live life angry all the time. And then what about negativity? It goes right along with this thought, I imagine. The world has a lot of negative Nellies. They drive us nuts. You ever met this person? They're always negative about something. Have you ever met this person in church? They're always negative about something. They never see the bright side of anything. Any decision that is made by the leadership is viewed selfishly as if this is not good for me, and some people are just negative about it. I think the boat has a lot of water in it when a person is negative all the time. The world has gotten into the Christian's heart. I saw an article, it was a blog article written by a fellow preacher not too long ago, and he asked this question, is your mood harming the church? And he wrote, I believe one of the biggest reasons why some churches go through a decline in mood and eventually membership is because of the pessimistic and negative attitude of church members. Sometimes it exists in the leadership, sometimes with the preacher, but often it exists in the membership. Think about how unrealistic we are if we're negative. We're always griping. We always see the negative. And then we'll turn around to the people that hear this and see this all the time. Maybe it's someone we live with or we go to school with or we work with, and we'll say, hey, but by the way, we're having Friends Day next week. Do you want to come to church with me? How can you really show the world what's right about the church if you're always negative about the church, but then every now and then you throw out the invitation to come to church to someone? Now, I know a lot of people who are negative, they don't worry about inviting other people. They wouldn't want anybody else to come. That's how negative they are about their church. Yet they just keep on going and attending and griping, complaining. But just think about the influence that our negativity has. Listen to what Paul said about this, Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 14, going to verse 15. He said, do all things without complaining and disputing. Why? That you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom, he says, you should shine as lights. If I could just paraphrase that, Paul said, quit your grumbling and complaining because you are in the world and the world is seeing you. You're supposed to be a light to the world, and there's no way you can do that if you're grumbling and complaining all the time about something. You're no different than the world if you're always grumbling and complaining. It's a selfish sin to grumble and to complain. And then the last of these, that we often will exchange a desire for the destiny that we are going to have, is what you might call a spiritual sin. And I know someone's already thinking, well, aren't all sins spiritual sins? Well, yes, in one sense. But you know, some of the very worst sins that Christians commit are sins that come under the veil or the umbrella of acting like a Christian, of supposedly being a Christian, when we're really not a Christian. One of the most obvious ones of those is hypocrisy. Every Christian has probably played the hypocrite at some point in their life. It's easy when we're guilty of sin to talk and to walk among those who are watching us as if we act like we haven't committed that sin. But listen to what Paul said about this as he described this sin in Titus 1 verse 16. He said, they, talking about people who are guilty of this, they profess to know God, but in their works they deny Him. That's what hypocrisy is. Professing to know God, saying you know God, saying you're a Christian, but the way you live, you deny Him. And Paul says these people are being abominable, disobedient, and disqualified in every good work. If I'm a hypocrite, Paul says that I am detestable. He says that I am disobedient, and he says that I am disqualified. See, hypocrisy not only hurts the one who's the hypocrite, but it hurts the ones who are around the hypocrite. It hurts God because He sees all, He knows all, He's disappointed. It hurts the lost. The number one excuse that many people give for not coming to church, you've heard it. They say, why should I go to church and sing, "Oh, how I love Jesus" with people that don't act like it, who are hypocrites? You've heard the excuse that people use. So being a hypocrite harms the lost. And it also hinders the work of the church. Paul said that the one who professes to know God and then denies it with their work is disqualified. Disqualified. If you're living the life of a hypocrite, it's going to be pretty hard to be qualified to help the church. What about an unforgiving spirit? This is another one of the spiritual sins. People who say, I'm a Christian. They sing, "Oh, how I love Jesus." They praise and thank God for the gift of His Son upon the cross. And then when someone sins against them, they're not willing to forgive them. It's one of the most amazing spiritual sins that we can commit. Being unwilling to forgive a fellow sinner, even though we see ourselves being forgiven by God. You know, one of the most powerful stories that Jesus told about this, as you remember, was about a man who owed his king an amount of money. 10,000 talents is how it's described. It's an amount of money, we're not sure exactly how much that would equate to today, but it is this. It's the amount of money, if you owed somebody this amount of money, you could never in your lifetime repay. You can never repay it. And yet the king forgave his servant of this debt that he could never repay. You know what this servant did? Presumably, on the way home from being forgiven of this great debt, he met a guy that owed him 100 denarii. You know what a denarii is? It's a working day's wage. He met a guy that owed him 100 working days' wages. It would be the equivalent of a few $1,000 to most people today. You know, nothing to just say, well, that's nothing. It was a debt, but it was something that would have been manageable for anybody to at some point be able to repay. And when he met this guy that owed him the 100 denarii, he demanded it, and he wouldn't forgive him of his debt. Well, word got back to the king. And when he heard that this forgiven debtor was unwilling to forgive someone who owed him a debt, I guess the best word is, he unforgave the man of the great debt that he had. He said, now I'm going to hold you accountable for this debt. And this is what Jesus said about that. He said, so my heavenly Father also will do to each one of you who does not forgive his brother his trespasses. It's a spiritual sin to be unwilling to forgive someone. And then, lastly, just think about complacency. You know, many churches today suffer from a spirit of, I don't care. I don't care. It manifests itself in the problem of, I won't work. If you don't care about something, you're not willing to do anything for it to help it. The Barna Research Group recently did a study, and this study concluded that 90% of the work in most local churches is accomplished by 10% of the people. I've heard all my life about the 80-20 principle that said that 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. Sometimes it's been said 80% of the giving is done by 20% of the people. But according to this latest research, that's wrong. It's worse than we thought. Complacency is more widespread than we thought. People don't care, and so therefore they're not willing to work. I mean, how else do you explain it? If somebody doesn't work, they just don't care. And see, when you read and study the Bible, the faithful Christian is not a complacent Christian. Faithful Christians do things in the privacy of their home, like pray and study, that maybe goes unnoticed. But they also do things that other people see, like defend the faith, sacrifice to work in the church. They're even willing to be a public spectacle if need be, to be persecuted or even offer their life for their faith. That's what faithful Christians do. Complacent Christians don't. I'd like for you to consider, as we close this lesson, we've been talking about how it's possible for us today, just like Esau did long ago, to exchange our destiny for desire. The truth of the matter is, though, that the great contrast in what we've been talking about in this lesson is found in Galatians, the 5th chapter. And if your sins and your selfish desires are controlling you, and they become more important right now than the hereafter, then your desire is the works of the flesh. And this is what Paul says about that. He says the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I've also told you in times past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Everything we've talked about today fits into the works of the flesh. It's exchanging a destiny for a desire. The great news is, it's possible for you to change that. It's possible for you to exchange right now the desires that are controlling you for a spirit that will create a destiny for you. The great thing about it is, not only will it create a destiny, a spiritual destiny for you after this life, it'll change your life right now. So when you contrast the works of the flesh with the fruit of the Spirit, it's love and joy and peace and long-suffering and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. And Paul says, against such there is no law. And listen to what he says. And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. That's our challenge, is to crucify the flesh with its passions and desires. The challenge for us is not to allow any desire right now that is sinful to dictate our destiny. Don't make the same mistake that Esau made in the Old Testament, to think about the now, the here, instead of the hereafter. And today, if you need to make a bold change with your life, if you need to crucify the flesh with its passions and desires, won't you come make a change? If it involves becoming a New Testament Christian, believing that Jesus is the Son of God, repenting of your sins, a change, confessing Him before men, being baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, then do it. Make that bold statement, that bold change in your life. Perhaps as a Christian, you've wandered back into the works of the flesh. The desires of now are more important than the destiny of the hereafter. Come back home. Make the change. Paul says, if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Do you need to start walking in the Spirit again today? If you need to respond, we want you to come. We want you to come right now. Together we stand and as we sing.